Cool. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Julia Pameli. I'm an MPP student at the Harvard Kennedy School and also a research assistant at the Reimagining the Economy program. Our next session is Industrial Policy for Innovation. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. To my left, Ernesto Stein. He's Distinguished Professor in Public Policy at the School of Social Sciences and Government and School of Public Transformation at the Tecnologico de Monterrey. He was previously the Inter-American Development Bank representative in Mexico. Chiara Criscuolo is the head of Productivity, Innovation and Entrepreneurship Division at the OECD. Munseob is assistant professor of economics at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. Professor Barry Naughton is the Kwan Chair of Chinese International Affairs at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. And finally, the moderator for this panel is Ji Bei. She is an associate professor of public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. It's my pleasure to hand over proceedings.
All right. First, I would just like to thank the organizers for putting together this wonderful panel. And it's really my great pleasure and honor to be the moderator for this panel. I think this is such a unique opportunity where we have experts representing such a wide range of countries and regions in the world, from Latin America, OECD countries, and key players in Asia, so South Korea and China. I think, when the topic for this panel is about thinking about industrial policy for innovation. Okay, I think where really hearing and learning from such diverse experiences from different countries and different parts of the world is going to be very valuable, because this is exactly one of the areas where I think as of now, evidence is still very thin. We're going to talk about a lot of the challenges, why, both in terms of the measurement and causal identification, but also that's why learning from different past experiences and lessons from different countries would really generate a lot of insights for us to think about, inform the discussion and policy going forward. Okay, so if I may, let me just put forward three kind of, I think, overarching central questions that we may come back to during this panel, related in thinking about thinking about industrial policy or innovation policy to foster innovation. The first question is really the kind of the fundamental question, which is, what is the underlying rationale? Why? How can industrial policy help to foster innovation? What problems could industrial policy help to fix? It's more like a theoretical question. What is the rationale? The second question is going from theory to empirics to actual policy practice and implementation. In practice, does it actually work? Does industrial policy successfully foster innovation? Maybe for some countries, but not for all countries. Why is that the case? What are some of the examples where government countries have done well and not so well, and what can we learn from these empirical implementation, lessons? And the third question is more of a forward-looking question for many of our young scholars and students here, which is, what are the key knowledge gap as of now? Going forward, how can we think about doing research and policy work to try to narrow the gap, to learn more about, how to have good industrial policy in the space of, thinking about innovation? Okay, great. Okay, so with that very high-level overarching questions in mind, let me turn the mic to, I think, Ernesto, you're the first one. Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little more broadly than just innovation about industrial policies in general, but I'm going to provide several specific examples from the area of innovation. And I just want to start by saying that Latin America is full of examples of bad industrial policy. So this caricature that Nathan was talking about yesterday about the industrial policy as we used to see it, like basically protection for uncompetitive sectors in response to lobbying activity, is alive and well in Latin America. But fortunately, along with these policies, there is a lot of good industrial policy. And so let me provide a simple example of two different industrial policies with respect to the same sector, which is rice. So there's an example in Costa Rica. There's an institution called Conarroz, and it groups the growers and rice processors. And Conarroz has really very sophisticated lobbying capabilities, and they have been able to obtain very high tariffs for the sector. And when domestic production is not enough to cover local demand, then Costa Rica extends tariff-exempt import permits to the rice processors. So rice processors can buy rice abroad cheaply. They process it, they sell it within Costa Rica at very high prices. And so this entails very significant transfers from the poor rice consumers to the rich rice processors. So compare that with the case of rice policies in Argentina. In Argentina, there's also an institution called ProArroz, and they group the rice growers in the province of Entre Rios, and they were producing a low quality variety of rice, and they exported to Brazil. There was a big devaluation in Brazil, and they lost competitiveness. But in Argentina, there's the INTA, the Instituto Tecnologico, Instituto Nacional de Tecnología Agropecuaria. They were developing new rice varieties of better quality, better adapted to the local conditions of Entre Rios. So the growers in ProArroz asked the local government to levy a tax on rice sales and to use the proceeds of that tax in order to accelerate this process of the development of a new variety. And this is exactly what happened. INTA came out with a new variety, rice growers regained competitiveness, and this is what happened to rice productivity in Argentina and in Costa Rica as a result. So it is obvious that there are good industrial policies and there are bad industrial policies. And for policymakers, a key question is, how can I tell them apart? And so in a book we did several years ago at the IDB called Rethinking Productive Development, we developed a conceptual framework to precisely help guide policymakers in terms of how to tell the good from the bad. And this conceptual framework started with three basic questions. The first one is, what is a market failure that we are trying to address? The second one is the policy intervention a proper remedy to solve this market failure? And the third one is, does the country have the required institutions to adopt the policy effectively? And together with these simple questions, we came up with a classification of what we call productive development policy interventions along two dimensions. One is their scope. They can be horizontal or they can be vertical, targeting some specific sectors. And the other one is their type. They can take the form of public inputs or market interventions like tax breaks, like subsidies, like protection. And so here are some examples of interventions in each one of these categories. And I'm not going to talk about the horizontal public inputs. They're very important. They're not controversial. Nobody ever doubted that the government had something to do in this quadrant. So let me start with the second quadrant, the horizontal market interventions. And here, I think it's very important to start with the first question. What is the market failure that we are trying to address? And so these are interventions that try to stimulate certain activities, not certain sectors, but activities like R&D, investment in machinery, workers training, etc. And the first question should be, what is the market failure? So if I think about research and development, there is a potential spillover. It has a mind of its own. There's a potential spillover that may require an intervention. But if I think about investment in machinery, unless this is the first machine of this type that one brings into this market, and there are some demonstration effects, I argue that the policymaker should ask himself this question. Where's the failure, okay? And if there is no clear answer to this question, they should not intervene. So this focus on market failures, also I try to let it guide also the empirical work that I get involved in. So in a recent paper with Gustavo Crespi, I don't know why this is automatically switching, but with Gustavo Crespi and other authors, we looked at two different government programs in Chile to support innovation. So one is called Fontec, and this funds innovation projects, R&D projects internally within a firm. And the other one is called Fondef, and they subsidize collaborative R&D between firms and research institutes. And along the lines of this focus on market failures, we wanted to know what is the impact on productivity of the direct beneficiaries, but also what are the spillovers? What is the impact on the productivity of other firms that are in the same sector and in the same region as beneficiaries? It turns out that Fontec, which funds intramural R&D, and Fondef, they have similar impact on the productivity of the direct participants, but they're very different in terms of their spillovers. Only the program that funds collaborative R&D between firms and research institutions had spillovers. So this should provide some guidance about the type of programs that one might want to support. In terms of the second question, how do I come up with a program or an intervention that fits very well with the market failure? I want to talk very briefly about the self-discovery problem that Danny and Ricardo worked on a while back. There's a pioneer who wants to discover whether the country can be good at producing something. Here, there's an example from the blueberry production in Argentina. There was a pioneer who had to invest in importing different varieties of blueberry seedlings, planting them in different parts of Argentina. And he didn't know if this would pan out or not. And it turns out that it did. He discovered that Argentina was a suitable location for blueberries. But he discovered something else very interesting, which is that Argentina could harvest blueberries after the summer production window in the US, but before the production in Chile kicked in. So it was able to get to market in the US at a time of low supply and fetch very high prices. But obviously this didn't go unnoticed, and soon there were many companies producing blueberries and exporting blueberries from Argentina. So this is the market failure. There are clear spillovers. What is the intervention? Well, the intervention that we proposed was a subsidy to pioneers, not in proportion to their own exports, but in proportion to the exports of their followers. So the subsidy is proportional to the size of the externality, and it provides incentives for the pioneers to invest in self-discovery, but also to share the knowledge with potential followers. So now let me get to vertical policies. And vertical policies have been much more controversial. And we know that many people say government should stay away from vertical policies. We cannot pick winners. They are subject to rent seeking, to capture, etc. But I think one of the nice things of this framework is that you can see clearly that there are different types of vertical policies. And it is what I think market interventions are the ones that are clearly riskier, subject to rent seeking and capture. And I think that the vertical public inputs are really at the heart of what a good modern industrial policy should be. An example is phytosanitary services for the fruit sector, or the development of rice varieties, or worker training program in a certain industry, et cetera, et cetera. So there's two key aspects of vertical public policies. One has to do with private-public collaboration. It is crucial. So the policymaker doesn't necessarily know what the public inputs that the private sector needs in order to be competitive. This information resides mostly within the public sector. So it is very important to set up mechanisms of private-public collaboration. Danny has argued that this is probably one of the most important features of a good industrial policy. It is very important to set up mechanisms that facilitate this private-public collaboration in order for policymakers to identify what are the obstacles, what are the needed public goods, and how to bring solutions to the table. So this is one of the problems in this quadrant. The other problem has to do with public-public coordination. Piero Gessi was talking about this a lot. The example of the Minister of Tourism, who identifies that in order to develop a new tourist destination, I need like access roads and I need worker training so that they can better serve the visitors, but the Minister of Tourism is not responsible for paving roads and is not responsible for training workers. So he needs the support or to coordinate with the Minister of Public Works and the Minister of Labor, and coordination within the public sector is very difficult. Sometimes it looks like this. This is the actual logo of the system of transportation in Manchester. And as you can see, it's not just a matter of bringing the three ministers together and hope that coordination will happen. Things can be gridlocked, like in this example, and you have to think of deliberate mechanisms to unblock this kind of things, like this little round gear in the middle of those three ministries that when it turns in one direction, all the three ministers and the private sector perhaps work together for the same goal. So the mesas ejecutivas that Piero was talking about, or the mesas sectoriales that I brought to Argentina using the Peruvian example, or the programas estratégicos de la Corfo in Chile, kind of want to focus on precisely these problems. Like, how do I elicit private-public collaboration, and how do I elicit cooperation, coordination within the public sector? So these mesas, the way I see them, are this little red gear that makes the system work. So now we get to vertical market interventions, and these are the riskiest. So here we're talking about subsidies, tax breaks, protection in specific sectors, and this obviously has a direct impact on the bottom line of these firms. So firms will have the incentives to lobby those who benefit from these programs, to lobby for their continuation. Those who don't have access to this, they're going to lobby in order to obtain these benefits. So these are the policies that are most subject to rent seeking and to capture, etc. It's not that there are no policies in this quadrant that are worth doing. We have a wonderful example, maybe in the questions and answers I can talk more about that, of the Costa Rican investment attraction agency targeting a very specific chain, like link in the value chain of medical devices, in order to allow Costa Rica to move from very simple medical devices to very sophisticated ones. This is the #1 export industry in Costa Rica today. And then conversely, we also have examples like industrial promotion regime in Tierra del Fuego that is subject to that is a protection scheme that has 50 years old already, and is completely is protecting a completely uncompetitive electronic sector in response to the lobbying capacity of a couple of very powerful firms. So there is good and there is bad industrial policy in Latin America. It's important, I think, to provide tools so that policymakers can tell them apart. Thank you.
Thanks, Ernesto, for sharing with us so many good examples and bad examples. I'm sure we will circle back to a lot of the important points you made, but definitely I think as back to the one of the central questions that we always have to start with the question asking what is the market failure that we're trying to address, right? That kind of provide a foundation for thinking about policy interventions. But I think you're also very right on the point that even if you know the market failure, it's not clear whether policy implemented in the wrong way could actually, address or exacerbate the market problem. So we can come back to some of the discussion points you raised. So now let's switch regions to OECD countries. Yeah, Chiara, I would like to hear from you about the innovation landscape in OECD countries and what what policies have been in place and does it work or not, and yeah.
Okay. So first of all, let me thank the organizer for having me in this great panel. Let me also say that I'm not at the OECD right now. I'm on a sort of leave of absence to the IFC. So whatever I will say does not reflect the view of either of these organizations. So I can say whatever I want for once in my life. So I take full responsibility. So let me start perhaps by saying something that will nuance what Nathan said yesterday. And I think when we think about innovation policies, exactly because there are quite well-known market failures, there hasn't been really a lot of controversy on whether the government should play a role in supporting innovation. The question is more how it should do it. And I don't know if there are some slides that I shared with you. So one point that I think is important to make is that I think there is a traditional way of doing, and let me call it innovation policies or industrial policy for innovation, which very much focus on correcting notably two main market failures. One is knowledge spillovers that Ernesto was mentioning about. One is more about the asymmetries of information that affect the financing of innovation, especially for startups and especially for firms with very low collateral. One way of solving this is for governments to really focus on sort of supporting the level of R&D investment that is happening in a country. And the way this has been done, especially in the 2000s, is very much setting targets. And I think one of the famous targets that probably those of you are familiar with European innovation policy landscape is the 3% Barcelona target that, basically by 2010, European countries should achieve the 3% R&D relative to GDP ratio. And in fact, when we think of this as being one of the key targets of the growth strategy, the Lisbon growth strategy in Europe, we think, okay, perhaps this is old innovation policy. In fact, when we look, and this is what I'm showing you, this is actually still happening. And as of December 2020, we had 27 OECD member countries that actually had targets. And for once, the US is a bit of an exception. It's one of the few countries that doesn't have an R&D target. Now, this is very much, I think, something that is still common. So countries trying to push the level of R&D. What is new in the new sort of innovation policies? The fact that I think there is much more awareness today and the acceptance, I would say, that government is not enough for government to just support the level of R&D, but very much steering, and let me also use the word directing, R&D investment in a particular direction. And this type of awareness, I think, has been, and this acceptance has grown much, much more with the COVID crisis, with the geopolitical tension, sort of focus on security, but perhaps even more because of the climate challenges and the fact that we again set a target of climate neutrality by 2050 that cannot be achieved without innovation. And in fact, let me put this slide, which I like very much, because I mean, we talked yesterday about IRA. And when we look at the levels of expenditure, at the amounts, we see very much that in terms of billions spent, the US might appear like an outlier with more than $600 billion announced in the IRA for supporting low carbon technologies. But when we actually normalize for the size of the country and for the size of GDP, we see that the US is not such an outlier. You see that countries like Italy, like Canada, like Denmark, that was mentioned yesterday by Mariana, are actually spending, I would say, sizable amount of their GDP, or they have announced to be going to spend a sizable amount of their GDP on supporting low carbon technology. Why is this important? And let me go back to the point of market failures here. So relative to the traditional market failures that affect innovation, green innovation have to face additional challenges. One is the standard environmental externalities, and I think Danny put it very nicely yesterday, in a global reality where carbon is not priced or is priced at a too low a level, there are not going to be enough incentives for firms to invest in this market. And so again, taking what was said yesterday as an example, the government has a role to play in creating and shaping the market for this low carbon technology. The second main reason is that, again, the market failures that we discussed, i.e. the knowledge spillovers and the credit constraints, are actually found to be much higher for low carbon technologies. And thirdly, there is a problem that has been described quite, I would say, intensively by Aguillon and co-authors, that there is lock-in in old sort of dirty technologies and path dependencies that need to be sort of broken. So for this reason, there is sort of, I think, a widely accepted view that government has a role to play in steering innovation. Now, this does not come easily, as Mariana said, the government needs to intervene when things are difficult. And for the government, there are lots of problems, the traditional capture, rent seeking, and so on. I want to focus on two main points. One is that there is a difficult balance to be maintained between supporting adoption of technologies that already exist, sort of the deployment and the adoption phase, and focusing on the sort of technology-ready innovations, and then also support the more radical, more technologies that have low technology readiness. And this balance, I think it's very hard to achieve. And let me make a point on this, especially when we think about green innovations. What we see when we focus on these measures that I just described in this graph, at the OECD, we focus on 51 countries. So this includes EU, OECD, other non-EU OECD countries, and G20, non-OECD G20 countries. So really a large spectrum of countries. We see that when we look at the type of projects that are supported, more than 70% of the support go to sort of adoption of existing mature technologies. And less than 15% actually goes to R&D and demonstration projects or to the pre-adoption phase. And so here what you see is there is a ratio of 1 to 5. So how much is spent on supporting the sort of more radical or more new technology vis-a-vis what is spent on actual adoption and deployment of existing technology. This ratio, according to the literature, and there is a very nice paper of Caroline Fisher and co-authors, should be 1 to 1, maximum 1 to 2. So you see that the balance is not really ideal. And this is particularly important because we know from some modeling that we have done at the OECD that the actual impact on the reduction of the cumulative emission of carbon is going to be much higher for each dollar spent on RD&D relative to $1 spent on adoption. So you need to do both, but you need to get the balance right. So that, I think, is the biggest challenge for innovation policies for the green transition. The second main point that I want to make is one that we still need to be very careful, especially when we think about industrial policy for innovation, about not unintendedly supporting incumbents and large players in the market. This is, I think, particularly true for green, for digital, but I think in a world where we have seen in the US, but also in Europe, we have some work that we are doing at the OECD, an increasing concentration, probably linked to the technological change, but also a steady, I would say, a non-decline of entrenchment, and in some case, an increase in entrenchment. So we don't want industrial policy for innovation to actually be strengthening this type of process, and we want really industrial policy to help maintain a creative destruction in the market, sort of this Schumpeterian idea that you need to support potential entrants and not just incumbents. So why am I mentioning this? Because one of the most used policy that we think is horizontal is actually R&D tax credit. And when we think about R&D tax credit, we say, okay, this is a bottom-up type of technology, the market type of policy, the market is going to decide, each firm will decide where it's more convenient for them to spend this R&D. In fact, we have that, 21 countries have introduced in OECD economies R&D tax credit, but the design of this R&D tax credit is very different across countries. And one message I would like to give and to really, hopefully you get, is the fact that design is key. So the devil is really in the detail. It's nice to speak about general terms, but when we need to look at specific design of tool. And let me make one point about this. There are two, for example, when you do R&D tax credit, you can introduce sort of refundability type of measures that they basically detach how much R&D tax credit you get from your loss or profit making position. And we see that these type of measures, together with measures that, for example, focus on withholding payroll taxes, actually are much more effective in supporting especially SMEs. And in a peculiar way, we also find that when you have threshold and ceilings, then we are not going to support larger firms that might not actually need the R&D tax credit. So it's really, it's important, this point of design. The second point I want to make on R&D tax credit is they're still a very important tool, but it's becoming more and more evident that they cannot be the only tool in the toolkit of policymakers. Why? Because we see from a study that we have done that R&D tax credit are much more effective in supporting development relative to actual basic research. And the opposite is true when we look at grants. So you really need to have both of these tools in use. And they're very much complementary. They're not substitutes. This is something that we find. Final point on this, heterogeneity is very important. So we need to be careful when we move from micro estimates to macro estimate. And this is a study also that we are doing, and I think is very relevant to understand the dynamics of how this policy actually work in practice. Let me close. So I think 3 main messages here. Some of them I've managed to make. Some of them I hope will come in the discussion. One, policy mix is important. You want to have both research and development and demonstration, as well as support for adoption and deployment. This is particularly important for the green transition, but let me say it's also important for the digital transition to make it more inclusive. And I hope Professor Acemoglu this afternoon will talk about his work on this. Second, you need to have horizontal, and I put horizontal sort of with what in French called guillemets, like it's not, an horizontal policy doesn't really exist, but you also need it to combine it with targeted policies. And you need to see innovation policy not like the place where lions can eat sort of a niche area of policy, which is I think what traditionally has happened. You need to put innovation policy at the center together with other measures, and a similar role I would say it's for antitrust agencies that are particularly important to maintain a level playing field, which, as I said, is key in a dynamic sense. One point I also want to make is combining innovation and environmental policy is key for cost effectiveness. Neither of them are going to be sufficient on their own. And then I hope we're going to discuss about the role of governance. And this is something that Mariana spoke a lot yesterday about. One thing that I would like to stress is the importance of evaluation. Perhaps there need to be methodological innovation on how we do evaluation of policy, especially long-term ones like innovation policy. But I think this is something that we shouldn't give up. And I think the chair was asking, future research areas, evaluation of these type of policies, I think is a key one. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Chiara. Let's definitely come back to the last point you made. How do we make good evidence-based policy for research and policy making going forward? And so let's first turn to Munseob and to hear about lessons and insights from South Korea.
Okay, so thanks organizers for having me, and I will talk about the case of my home country, the Korea, that showed the growth miracle. At the same time, the providing the largest scale the government interventions, including the innovation, the policies. The Korean government provided the tax exemptions for the expenses for adoption of the foreign technologies starting from 1966. So from then, 100% of the royalty payment for the first 5 years became tax deductible. And then starting from the 1982, the Korean government started providing tax exemptions for the expenses for the research and development expenditures. When they started from the 10% of the R&D expenditures becoming the tax deductible. According to the Ernesto's the powerful the 2x2 matrix, that those were the examples of the horizontal, the market interventions. And that's also related to the tension that Chiara mentioned between the adoption and the research and development. So by exploiting these opportunities, the Samsung Electronics, the LG Electronics, the Hyundai, the heavy, the industry companies, so they adopted the foreign technologies and began their own research and development. So in some sense, the policy was successful, but here I want to discuss why the Korea's innovation policy was the successful case. I believe. The first, The technology advanced the nearby country, which was Japan, and they were willing to sell technologies toward the Korean firms. And second, the transition from the adoption to innovation was led by the private companies like Samsung Electronics during the 1970s, the late 1970s. And then it was further supported by the government starting from the early 1980s. So let me begin with the first secret, I believe. So while the number of the technology adoption, the total number of technology adoption increased from only 18 in 1966, the year of the first year of the adoption supporting policy, to 291 in 1979, within 10 to 20 years, the Korea relied heavily on Japan. So here I'm showing you one graph. X-axis is the year, starting from 1960s until the 90s. And then the Y-axis is the share of the adoption by the source countries. During this important period of kicking off the economic development, technology development, the Korea heavily relied on Japan. The 50 to 70% of the technology came from the Japanese companies. So for example, the LG Electronics, purchased the technology to produce the TV from Hitachi, the Japanese company. And then within a few years, within the less than 10 years, the Samsung Electronics became the major competitor in the global market. So later, Hitachi said they regret the decision to sell their technology. They didn't expect that Samsung Electronics can catch up this quickly and become a threat. So that is related to the secret, I believe. So Samsung Electronics and many private companies initially grew with the adapted technologies they purchased from Hitachi, and then invested their profits heavily toward the research and development instead of distributing those toward the shareholders. Those are the examples. The Samsung Electronics, it was established in the 1969. If you don't know about the history of the Samsung Electronics, so you may think that, okay, it's younger than you may think. In the same year of establishment, they purchased the technologies. And then it took 7 years for them to first report the positive expenditures on the research and development. And it took another 2 years for them to finally apply for the first ever patent. So that's the history of the Samsung Electronics there, the technology development. And we can see the similar cases from other companies and other sectors. The Miruto and Dani yesterday discussed about the shipbuilding industry. So the Hyundai, the shipbuilding company, that's exactly what they did. They purchased the technology from the UK. I checked this data, and then I found that they also purchased the technology from Japan, France, Spain. And within a few years, they spent the profit on the research and development, and they became the competitive player in the global market. So they started the transition during the late 1970s. And that's the observation I have by looking at this data. And then after the few years later, the government shifted the tax benefits from adoption toward the innovation. The 1982, that was the first year the Korean government started providing the R&D tax credit. I told you that they started from the 10%. Nowadays, it is above the 30%. So it was the kind of reallocation. So instead of abolishing the support on the adoption and then solely supporting the innovation, so they basically decreased the support on the adoption and gradually increased the support on innovation. So then the natural question is whether the case of the Korea could be replicable or not. Yesterday, Rohit greatly walked through us to think about whether the Chinese industrial policies could be replicable in India. Here, I want to conclude the remark by telling you 2 challenges I believe the emerging economies nowadays are facing while they conduct the similar the technology, the innovation, the policies. The first, advanced economies nowadays are less willing to sell their technologies. So think about the case of Hitachi. So whenever you decide to sell your technology, you are facing the trade-off. You get a static gain, you get the royalty payment, but you also anticipate the future, the loss, because the buyer is going to catch up the technology and become the competitor in a few years. So the companies are always facing, the US companies, Japanese companies, including the Korean companies nowadays are facing this trade-off between the static gain and dynamic loss. I think those advanced economies companies are now internalizing the possibility and the size of the dynamic loss more and more. And we also see the series of export bans implemented by the US and other countries, the banning the export of the strategically important technologies. And second, the domestic companies may not have an incentive to move from adoption to innovation. So when Hitachi sold the technology to Samsung Electronics, they sold the technology to produce the low quality TV. I mean, that was already good enough for the Korean consumers, but Samsung Electronics, their target market was not Korea, but the global market. That was because the Korea had always had the export-oriented structure. So I believe it might be the too strong argument. I think the export-oriented economy could be the necessary condition to promote this the natural and desirable transformation from adoption to innovation. I mean, we can talk more about that during the Q&A if anyone has the question. I will stop here. Thanks.
So great. So there, let's now hear the last one. Now you heard everyone on this panel. So yeah, I'd love to hear from your experiences like working on China.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? So I feel sort of like
Could you check if it is on?
there we go. Is that better? All right. And so what I'd like to do is three things. First of all, I want to briefly talk about three different phases of Chinese technology and industrial policy. I'm going to also smear these together. I know they're definitely separable, but the impact of Chinese government thinking about technology is so enormous, and the way it links in innovation policy and industrial policy, I'm just going to treat them together for now. Then I'm going to make some suggestions about sort of the overall Chinese environment. And then quickly, just for fun, suggest a few maybe lessons. So let's look at the way that China's industrial policy has evolved over the last almost 20 years. Remember in the presentation yesterday about shipbuilding, they mentioned that 2006 was a kind of turning point where for the first time they see subsidies that can be clearly identified and tracked. And that makes sense because that's about 2006 is a sort of starting point for a type of Chinese industrial policy, a more narrowly defined industrial policy where we have clearly defined sectoral priorities. And the justification for that initial phase of industrial policy is completely opportunistic. Namely, China is looking for so-called new growth drivers. as a way to shift the growth momentum that had been already established for labor-intensive manufacturers, exports, things like that, to upgrade and lead to a new phase of economic growth. It's something very thoughtful and very familiar in a lot of ways in terms of the Korean, Japanese experiences in particular. And the program that comes out of that is Strategic Emerging Industries. By 2010, it's concretized, made clear. And one of the key elements is electric vehicles, right? Electric vehicles specifically because electric vehicles are conceptualized as an area where there are not incumbents in the global market. You know, internal combustion engines, you're going to have to compete with Toyota, you're going to have to compete with Volkswagen. But electric vehicles, remember this is 2006, there's no Tesla yet, right? So electric vehicles are an area where China senses opportunity. And as we all know today, but that's 15 years later, Chinese electric vehicles are in fact arriving on the global market on a massive scale. But you know what? In the meantime, the rationale driving China's industrial policy was fundamentally revolutionized around 2014 by the idea that there was a new technological revolution taking place and that China, for whatever reason, for a combination of strategic and economic motives, had to be at the forefront of this, had to compete. So China adopted an innovation-driven development strategy, right? Where the focus was on artificial intelligence, new materials, broadband communication, embedded sensors, smart, connected vision, right? Now, of course, it's a vision that I think today is pretty commonplace. We all think of that as what's happening in our economy today. Obviously, it's supercharged by the emergence of certain kinds of large language models and other types of more capable AI than we anticipated back then. But still, it's a pretty remarkable commitment of a government, remarkable in the breadth of it. It's also remarkable that a government would be willing to elevate strategic concepts into the core of their economic policy making. There's a couple pages of preamble to the innovation-driven development strategy that specifically say the country that masters this technological revolution is going to be the dominant power in the next global age. Boom. And we have to do it. Okay? So that is a completely different rationale than the earlier strategic emerging. Of course, strategic emerging industries don't go away. They maintain all their instruments, they maintain their importance, but this new thing is added on top. And then about 2019, but very, very explicit in 2020, new set of industrial policy objectives, which are self-reliance. Now, obviously, the self-reliance drive is triggered by the Trump administration measures. And then the Biden administration makes the tech embargo elements much more systematic and consistent and targeted. But China's response to this is equally strong, right? China's response was to adopt an intentional program of self-reliance. This doesn't just mean science, although it does mean that, but it also means the industrial base is to be inventoried and checked for specific areas of reliance upon imports, okay? So just to start, I mean, just look at what an astonishing array of rationales and objectives are incorporated into Chinese industrial policy. And obviously, to a certain extent, there must be contradictions, right? This is not a simple thing. Now let's take a little look at some more aspects of it. In the first two phases, most of the industrial policy instruments were what we might call market conforming. So when you think of the things that Yan was saying yesterday about the venture capital state, that all makes some sense, right? The these broad, especially the first couple stages, right? Opportunistic targeting of sectors, trying to position China for this technological revolution. These were areas where the central government didn't have really firm ideas about what the key industries and sectors would be. And so they introduced many, many different instruments, most of which were financial instruments, including the government guidance funds that you talked about. And also there's a relatively open attitude toward private firms, right? So Alibaba, Huawei, Tencent, these were all seen as national champions, along with some of the big state-owned firms. And it wasn't hard to understand what the government wanted you to do. There's money available, and the government wanted you to push toward these high-tech sectors. And you know, government guidance funds, possibly I showed a graph like this, but it was really small yesterday. Yeah, look at the ramp up between 2014 and 2020 of these industrial guidance funds. This is authorized capital. It's not like spending on an annual basis. But look at the authorized capital, $1.5 trillion US dollars. Peaking around 2020, and then actual spending kind of levels off, maybe partly because of COVID, but also because as the urgency of industrial policy steps up, as the emphasis on self-reliance increases, China's willingness, the willingness of China's leaders to rely on these kind of market-conforming instruments fades. It becomes more national security. It becomes more urgent. Resources increase, but willingness to rely on these kind of market-conforming instruments recedes. And of course, again, at the end of her talk, Yuan mentioned the biggest and the highest profile of these government guidance funds was the National Semiconductor Fund. And the head of it was thrown in prison on corruption charges. The head of it had been from a government-run financial agency. He's gone. He's been replaced by a government bureaucrat from the technology ministry, or sorry, the industry and information ministry. So in other words, these about 2/3 in terms of money are local, but the biggest are central. And this target is now the top target of the Chinese government. You know, the National People's Congress just met. During the National People's Congress Government Work Report lays out priorities for the coming year. This is the #1 priority for 2024, above expansion of aggregate demand. All the economists think expansion of aggregate demand should be the priority. This is. The English translation here is so bland. A modernized industrial system. Of course we want a modernized industrial system, but actually when you probe into it, it's not bland. What this slogan means is that the modern global high-tech economy is composed of an extraordinarily heterogeneous mix of entities, big firms, small firms, supply chain architects, specialized suppliers, service providers, all kinds of things. And China has to replicate all of these things domestically. It's one of the most extraordinarily ambitious targets you've ever heard of in your life. And that means not thinking of the economy as a bunch of sectors to target. It means thinking of the economy as a bunch of capabilities and a bunch of inputs that China has to have at least a second source. In other words, China is involved, China denies this, but China's involved in de-risking, right? It's a big part of China's industrial policy. And this means that the government's intervening a lot more in the nuts and bolts of the economy. It's doing things that are not just market-conforming instruments. And the most striking example of this is an innovation consortium. This is very similar to what Mariana was talking about at dinner last night. These are organizations where the government puts together labs, engineering firms, specialized suppliers, and end product businesses, and says, you guys have to sign contracts that specify particular engineering outcomes that are necessary on the way to our creation of a self-reliant industrial system. These targets should be, sort of 3 years from now, we'll have a certain target. For example, and this is not an imaginary example, we're going to produce the entire semiconductor equipment manufacturing chain. And that means we have to have lithographic capabilities. We're about 10 years behind ASML. So your first target will be 2 years from now to produce a type of DUV. We can't do EUV like ASML does, but we'll do primitive DUV in 2 or 3 years. And those targets are built into the contracting among these different entities. Whew. Is this industrial policy or is this planning? I don't know, it's somewhere in between, right? But it's definitely something we should be aware of. It's something that's happening. So that's my first point. The second point is, when we think about China, let's be restrained in what we say. Yesterday, I heard Rohit say, India can't be like China because China has cutthroat competition and decentralization more than India. Wow, okay. I don't disagree with that, but it's a very strong characterization, right? Yan stressed the freedom of adaptation of local government. All these important aspects to China, and yet most of the time when people talk about the China model, they're talking about government intervention. They're talking about close government business interaction, a highly intrusive party state that shapes nearly every aspect of incentive. And so I think we should be really careful about allowing ourselves to accidentally use certain memes about what China is. Because when you look at China, you see this pattern very often. Clumsy government policy that is redeemed by a responsive and flexible private sector. Look at the financial system. Chinese financial system is really clumsy. But small and medium enterprises have driven growth in many parts of the China's human resources. Could we possibly talk about China's R&D performance, China's catch-up, without talking about the remarkable investment in human resources that's occurred in China over the last 20 years? Of course not. But did the government invest a lot of money in human resources? China's never invested 4% of GDP on education. That puts it in the bottom half. What goes on? Chinese households spend much more than the Chinese government on education and human resources. So let's be super, super careful when we think about China models. Right? Let's not attribute any success to China models unless we can find the kind of nuanced evidence for it that we were discussing yesterday morning, which I completely agree with. So in spite of that, let me go out on a limb. Last slide here suggests there are a couple lessons from what we've seen in China. Number one, the learning curve. Nobody's mentioned it yet. It's the traditional justification for Japanese and Korean industrial policy back in the day. This is what we see in our world. Chinese scaling up of solar panels and batteries have made the green transition within reach. It's the one thing that so far has already really working, right? You double the production of solar panels, costs come down about 30%. But the implications of this for industrial policy are complex, right? Because that means you should concentrate on the biggest producers. That means you have to have trust and you want globalization. It's a lot to talk about. Number two, in the successful examples of Chinese industrial policy, and I'm thinking especially solar panels, batteries, and EVs, right? Because that's the moment we're at, right? Where these sectors in China are doing really, really well. In each one of these stories, the key events, I would argue, have been about Chinese entrepreneurs, often backed by their local governments, adapting global technologies, right? German ratepayers paid for the initial ramp up of the Chinese solar panel industry, et cetera, et cetera. But China's steady long-term commitment, especially to EVs, mattered a lot. They wasted a lot of money, right? They wasted $100 billion at least in failed EV policy before they finally got it right. And that's the cost benefit of that is really difficult, but it does show one thing is you can solve some problems by throwing money at them. All right, I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thanks to all of you. Should we go for quick Q&As now? Yeah.
I would like our moderator to say a little bit about her own work, because I think it's so germane to this discussion. Her work on innovation spillovers in the auto industry in China, because both the results are interesting, but also some of the challenges of causal inference in this literature as to. So I think if Jay, if you'd be kind enough to just add a few words on that, that would be great. I have so many questions, but I'll just focus on one to the panel in general. So I'm struck by the distinction, which sort of, Barry referred to a little bit, between sort of, the Latin America OECD perspective versus the East Asian perspective. When Ernesto and Chiara spoke, it was all about, focus on market failures. And I don't think Koreans were talking about, the Korean government in the 16th, 70s was worried about market failures. Barry said explicitly it has nothing to do with market failures. And the East Asian model seems to be much more sort of driven by visions of, what you want to closing the gap, getting technology sort of, or, so it's, we can try to find what the underlying market failure is, and we can try to read into it. But that's not really what they were doing. So I guess I would like, sort of Ernesto and Chiara to reflect a little bit about, what in their world would industrial policy look like? It was much more sort of this, driven by these visions and broader objectives, not so much focused, but focusing on getting the details right about the implementation and so forth. And for Barry and Munseob, maybe, sort of, is some of the failures of, I think maybe one way to read, Barry, what you were saying is that, so much money is wasted and not all of the, be careful about, sort of what you wish for. Is it that maybe if there was more focus on market failures, maybe some of it might have, but still leaves the puzzle, because we know the successes are in those cases, South Korea, China, where the market failure motive wasn't dominant. And we don't necessarily think of Latin America, for example. A quick last question in passing to Ernesto. Why are so many of the successes in industrial policy in Latin America in agriculture? Okay. So that's.
Thank you, Danny. Yeah, thanks. So I will say a few words about my work on the Chinese auto industry. Sort of the, Barry started talking about, China's industrial policy since the early 2000s, but what was China doing prior to 2000? So it's actually the experience is very similar to South Korea, what we learned from Munseob in terms of really trying to catch up to the frontier, adopting existing technologies. And the way that China did it, so I think the auto industry is one sector where, it's kind of tells us a story about the early kind of development stage and industrial policy in China in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So, in the auto sector, they're trying to learn from foreign companies. And there's this quid pro quo policy, which was one of the key stated justifications behind the Trump tariff in 2018, which is, basically inviting foreign firms to come in and having forced marriage, joint ventures with domestic automakers. As the rationale is also clear. It's not about addressing particular failures. It's just that we are behind. At the time in the 70s, China is in economic backwater. They have no capacity to produce domestic passenger vehicles. They want to learn from foreign firms to then, eventually be able to produce our own cars one day. So that was the rationale. And then the way that they did it is, I think, similar to Korea, but in a different way, which is we want to learn from foreign firms, and they wanted to learn in a way where we have these joint ventures as a way that, basically expose domestic firms more directly to these foreign technologies, hoping that they can catch up. But I think in the early phase, the policy heavily favored SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and the private firm. Geely, the stars, and in the EV sector nowadays, they had a hard time even just entering into the domestic market till the early 2000s. So then, when we looked at the impact of this joint venture, in terms of foreign technology transfer policy on domestic catch-up and domestic upgrading, it had an impact, but it was not the primary driver of domestic upgrading of the Chinese auto industry. And empirically, we know the stars in the best performing models in China are not produced by these SOEs. So that's if I have time, I wanted to come back to some of the points that Munseob and also Chiara mentioned about, for many developing countries. Now, there are these existing technologies out there. How can we strike this balance in terms of how much, resources to allocate in terms of helping firms to adopt existing technologies and versus pushing the frontier, having radical innovations. I think it seems like to me, the experiences from China and South Korea is like in the first phase, we try to adopt and try to catch up. And then at some point, policies start to shift gear towards more indigenous innovation and, trying to push the frontier going forward. Stop here. And yes, to all of you, to Daniel's questions.
So a couple of questions. So one question by Danny had to do with why are so many of these success stories in Latin America in agriculture. I think, there are success stories in other sectors, like in Brazil, starting I think in the 60s, the development of the aircraft sector, I consider a success story. Mexico is an industrial powerhouse that has been able to integrate with the global value chains in the United States. They also developed like a very strong sector in aeros, like aircraft industry, in auto industries, etc. And there are nice examples at the local level of states developing, like attracting investment in car parts, etc. The example of Costa Rica that I showed about the medical device sector, I really like that example as well. But Latin America has a comparative advantage in agriculture. We know that like there is this premature industrialization, as you have as in your work. So I think that in many countries in Latin America, Mexico I think is one exception, Costa Rica to some extent, many of the most important like opportunities will probably not be in manufacturing. And so that's why I have studied a lot lately issues in agriculture. And I think there are many cases that are very nice that are within that realm, but it is not exclusive. So this is part of the answer. Now, why focus on market failures when we see that in Korea and in China that hasn't been the most important driver. That is a great question. I don't dispute that one might want to have start with a vision of some sectors where a country can be an important player in, and then focus on developing those sectors. The history of industrial policy in Latin America is not a happy one in general, and the big problem, as I find, has been the ability of certain sectors and firms to lobby for protection and to obtain like the protection of very uncompetitive sectors. And if this were a case where I see these uncompetitive sectors and I realize these will continue to be uncompetitive, and so I dismantle these supports, that would be one story. But this is not the case. Like in Argentina, in Tierra del Fuego, electronic sector, the support has been there for 50 years and continues to be there. The rice policies in Costa Rica have been there for a long time. Everybody knows that it's a bad policy, and those policies continue. So in a way, for me, market failures is a way to discipline this process of designing policies and trying not to begin to support some sectors that are not competitive now, but they're not subject to the infant industry argument. It's not that if I start investing in them, I will become competitive. In that case, I think it's very much like justified to do that policy like Brazil did with the aircraft industry. But for me, thinking about market failures, disciplines, like and can help prevent many bad industrial policies, which are not dismantled when one realizes they're bad. They stay there forever, or at least for extended periods.
If I may add to this from a European perspective, I think, for a European, it's important to think about market failures because there is always this tension between having the single market working very well and having industrial policies. And in fact, lots of state aid rules allow industrial policy in very specific cases. So you need to have a market failures type of argument to be able, as a national country, to implement some of these policies. And to be honest, coming from Italy, like Mariana, I think we have seen many bad industrial policy and lots of capture as well. So it's not that, I think we still see mission-oriented policies in Europe and strong one, whether it's green, whether it's AI, and we still see a lot of focus on inequality and lots of the regional policies in Europe are very much to sort of level the differences across countries. But I think it's still important not to forget why some policies might be allowed in a single market and which ones we should sort of be wary of. So I think to me it's a bit like the case of Ernesto, where it's a very much a discipline instrument, the fact to think about market failures.
Okay, so I think the one difference between the Asian countries and Latin American countries could be the political regime. So Korea and China, most of industrial policy was led under the autocratic regime, having a leader and observing the successful case of the Japan in the case of Korea, and then the Japan and Korea in the case of the China. I want to quickly mention the one difference between Asia and Latin America that we haven't discussed so far. And in the case of the Korean government took the budget constraint into the consideration quite seriously. So the President Park Chung-hee during the 1960s and 70s, the Korean government didn't have money to conduct the industrial policy. So instead of raising the government debt, it was impossible because Korea didn't have a credit in the international financial market, or issuing out more money to create the inflation. The President Park Chung-hee was somewhat creative. So what he did during the 1960s was restoring the diplomatic relationship with Japan. And as a reward, the Korean government got the money. Instead of distributing that to the big teams under the Japanese occupation, they used that money to build the POSCO, the Pohang Steel, the company. And then they also sent the miners and nurses to Germany. And then using that as a collateral, the Korean government borrowed the money from Germany. When I look at the 1979, the year when Park Chung-hee died, and then the huge big push industrial policy ended, I could see some warning signs. The government that has been increasing the inflation rate was the 20%. So it's hard to tell the counterfactual scenario, but I can tell that maybe the one secret, the hidden secret behind the Korea's success was the coming from the fact that the industrial policy was somewhat short-living. So I was seeing the warning signs before the President Park Chung-hee died, but then it stopped, and then it moved to the stage of the consolidation. Anyway, so during the Korean industrial policy, we didn't see the too much rise in the government debt and too high the hyperinflation.
And just let me throw in a word, specific point. I mean, Korea and Japan spool down their sector-based industrial policies after their high growth period is ending. And they then subsequently introduce the market failure rationale saying, oh, that's what we did. And now that we're a more mature market economy and our corporations are stronger, they don't need that kind of government guidance, we can step back from industrial policy. Of course, what China has done is exactly the opposite, right? They didn't really need industrial policy during this blazing period of tremendous structural transformation. And there were so many good companies and so many good technologies, so many good examples to borrow from Japan and Korea, and especially Taiwan. You know, there wasn't really an industrial policy apparatus that affected in China. But then when they reached the end of the miracle growth and growth was slowing down and they had money, then they said, okay, now let's have a techno-industrial policy to push us to greatness.
That's very interesting. So I think we can still 10 more minutes because we started 10 minutes late. I see we have a lot of people lining up. Yes. Yeah, sounds good. So let's take a couple of questions and we can kind of consolidate them. And
I have a question on institutional arrangements. So when we're talking about this organization that will be in charge of the public coordination, I think there have been two different alternatives. One is maybe to house that organization in the Ministry of Production, like las mesas sectoriales in the Ministry of Production, or Produce in the case of Peru. But then one could also house it on the office of the president, which is something that, for example, Professor Matsukato was proposing for Brazil. So I was wondering, what are your opinions about the trade-offs between housing it in the Ministry of Production or any ministry, or maybe have the type of, let's say, what China has for energy, right? This inter-ministry commission of sorts.
Thanks. I unfortunately have to leave at 11 for a call, so I won't be able to hear the answer, but I'll put it out and someone will have to tell me what the answer was. Barry, what you just said is fascinating, because when I once spoke to the chief scientific officer for Israel, who was in charge of YOSMA, the public venture capital fund, similar to what we heard about yesterday, he said, Mariana, of course we're market shaping, but just let us pretend we're fixing markets so no one bothers us. So this thing about ex post, framing it as market failures is also so no one bothers you. However, I would say in Italy, what the problem is, I mean, those numbers you had up there, that's what Italy's going to get, right? From the next gen EU, they're getting the biggest share. In the past, Italy has had to send the money back because they have no implementation and administrative capacity. So unless these funds, the next gen EU or the trillions and trillions in this country, go to state capacity, and in this country it's at the level of states, but also federal, to administer this stuff, and that's where these dynamic capabilities, right? And the other thing is, in countries like Italy or the so-called pigs, you know, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, the capture, but also in Latin America, that has happened has often been when we do the old industrial policy that somehow here keeps coming up. It's, you know, this sector-based industrial strategy is what gets captured because those sectors lobby their way up to be considered key sectors. And that's the picking winners problem. Whereas proper mission-oriented innovation and industrial strategy, not the one that just uses the word, you know, old wine and new bottles, should actually create a tension that industries have to invest and innovate, train the workforce in order to meet those goals. That's not what happens in Italy, as I mentioned last night. They just hand out money to sectors that just come up with little, projects with no commitment. There's a question here with the CHIPS Act too, to what degree it's actually required versus just a fuzzy pre-commitment. So anyway, getting those details right to make sure that it's additionality and it's towards a goal that requires investment, innovation, transformation in a sector. That's key. Otherwise, we just go back to the old.
Yes. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is a student at Harvard Kennedy School. I have a question for Professor Naughton, if I may, about the heterogeneities in the effectiveness of industrial policies for innovation in the case of China. So we see cases like electronic vehicles and shipbuilding from yesterday that there are sort of huge successes in creating those outputs. But then in cases like semiconductors and other sort of more innovation or global supply chain driven industries, we haven't seen that kind of level of success in creating the output that we want. In the case of semiconductors, it's limited to DUVs, as you have suggested, and then and it's arguably not being able to achieve below 5 nanometers anytime soon. So I was wondering, how should we interpret sort of this heterogeneities in how China achieves its innovation policy results? Thank you. And any lessons that we can learn from that?
Okay. Maybe let's take 2 more questions. Yes, go ahead, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of foot stomp a little bit the point that Dr. Lee made about the political system. So Todd Tucker, Roosevelt Institute, a political scientist, so I want to make a political science point, which is how much, which is sort of preceding what, the political system or the sort of utilization of the concept of market failure as a disciplining device on the political system. So in Latin America, where you have extractive, unequal, oligarchic systems, to what extent is sort of the trying to narrow the justification for industrial policy to market failure kind of correcting for a political problem that you have in the country, rather than it being something inherent in the use of trade measures per se, but it's rather the trade measure is what's available to the political elites to sort of, limit their rents. And if they didn't have the political power in the first instance, maybe they wouldn't be able to push for that. But I recognize that it's also kind of a dynamic system that once you have the protection, and that also then reinforces the political power of that class. So I don't know if that, maybe Dr. Lee, that was sort of the what you were getting at, but just curious for any reaction to that.
Okay, one last question here, and we can have a lot of conversations at the break.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm also a political scientist, so I'm glad this question was made. I was about it to make it. But just one specific thing is, what sort of institutional arrangements, both in the political and the economic institutions, have you seen in terms of property rights, innovation in types of property rights to develop these sort of industrial policies in the different cases that you see? What sort of innovation do you see there?
I will try to kind of summarize and organize the discussion. So I think there's the first kind of overarching question, general theme is about coordination. So we will think about this kind of industrial policy at such massive scale in the semiconductor sector. For example, you have to organize the whole supply chain, and also someone mentioned about where is the right unit to house the government agency to solve the public or public-private coordination problem. So anyone would like to address these concerns?
I would just say one thing. I mean, there's some unknown optimal degree of coordination, which is counterbalanced by some unknown optimal degree of competition. We want to be able to wash out mistakes too. So one thing China has in the past done not too bad is allow the chaos of having a bunch of different approaches and a certain amount of competition that actually causes failure. I know that's not the intent of the question.
Perhaps one point. So, I think one point that is important is one that I think coordination is particularly important for this mission-oriented policy, but also to overcome a big problem of lack of capabilities in government. And I think the case that Mariana was making of Italy is a case in point, where we received a lot of money during COVID, but we just didn't have the right capabilities within the government to spend that money. And there were also lots of competition across ministries rather than coordination. And that has been, I think, a key reason for failures of implementation of this policy. And, basically the government hasn't been able even to spend the money, let alone spend it well. And so I think coordination is key. And we have seen in the work that we have done at the OECD as well, is that sometimes there is a lack of coherence in industrial strategies, not even the mission-oriented ones, whereby, you, for example, want to support innovation in green, but you're still giving subsidies to brown, or you spend a lot on investments for physical capital assets, and then you don't spend in the complementary capabilities of workers. And so these are kind of incoherences that could be solved. Was there more coordination? And where to put it, I think it depends very much on the institutional arrangements within countries. It could be within the government, outside the government. And so I think that you don't have a magic recipe for that.
One size fits all. Yeah. It's especially hard when you have different, you need to involve different parties, but different parties have very different, interests and objectives. Yeah. Okay, so the second question is around politics of industrial policy. So especially, sector-based industrial policy that's very subject to capture political risk. And anything wanted to address that kind of set of question?
I think that the point you make is a very relevant point. Like the context in which I think about industrial policies is the Latin American context, in which firms and sectors do have the power to extract rents and capture the policymakers. And so I have to think of ways to, in a way, try to curtail that. And under different contexts, maybe I would be thinking differently. Now, the market failures argument. So Mariana was talking about the Israel case with entrepreneurship, and that market failures didn't come into the picture. But there's, huge market failures when you think about startups. The knowledge market fail. I have a new idea, it can be copied. The knowledge externalities are very important. The credit constraints are very important. I have an idea, I cannot collateralize my idea. So this is an area rife with market failures, and Israel did tremendous job in the early 90s with programs such as the Tecnological incubators and the attraction of the venture capital industry when it didn't exist in Israel, with the YOSMA program, where the state put a lot of money in order to attract VC companies from the United States to come to Israel. And that's how the system got started, and then it was privatized later on. But even though maybe the discussion was not our market failures, I think market failures are key for these policies. There was a question about where to house these productivity task forces. I think. You have to have, like Matt Andrews was talking about authorization yesterday. You need to have someone who can move the levers of the public sector even beyond the ministry where they are. When Piero was at the Produce, because he had the respect maybe of other ministries, and because he had the support of the finance minister who has the purse, maybe he was able to make things work this way. When he left, and they wanted to transfer some of these mesas like to the agriculture ministry, nothing ever happened. And it was only when things went back to the Minister of Economics and Finance that things work. So I think it is important, either you have a leader who's a champion and he can, inspire other ministries to come to the table and do whatever they need to do in order to make things work, or you have to have someone with the authority, like in a Presidencia de Consejo de Ministros or the finance minister, or within the office of the president. But the president himself, if it's in the office of the president, has to see this as a priority. If you put it at a level of a ministry and the minister doesn't see this as a priority, this will not move.
Great. There's one last question about the role of the property rights when we think about its interaction with innovation policies, industrial policies. But I think a more general question, if I may add to that, is that some of you mentioned that industrial policy, nothing acts in isolation. It always interacts with other policies. And how do we think about, because of that, there could be intended or unintended consequences or complementarities between the different policies, and how should government think about that when they design industrial policies for a specific target?
Is there anyone?
I mean, maybe one point on intellectual property, which is, I think we know very little still on what is an ideal intellectual property regime. And I think when you look at the challenges that exist, and I mean, it could be from just the cost of applying to a patent to the cost of defending a patent. I think, there is still a lot that we don't know, but I think we also see in some cases that it has become in some countries, and I mean, I have in mind Poland because that's a country we looked at, whereby the cost of the whole IP system has actually become an hinder for innovation and innovation protection in SMEs that cannot afford the money. And I think the case is quite similar in the US, the lack of transparency. And I think, again, is one of those areas where it's normally seen as detached from the rest. The IP offices act a bit as an independent agency. And so just to mention a silly thing that, I mean, I found very fascinating, but quite worrying, is the fact that you don't have to register necessarily when a patent is sold. So you don't register with the new owner, except in some cases. So imagine you are a new player coming into the market and you don't really have clear transparency with the owner of the patent that you might be infringed. And there is no immediate willingness or interest in changing this type of framework where there is no need to record who is the owner of an IP. And so to me, these are like easy, low-hanging fruit, but somehow because IP is not considered such a key area, we don't really spend time discussing these, for example, in general industrial strategies. So I think there is a lot that we don't know, there is a lot that can be done, and there are lots of low-hanging fruit. So that's something that is becoming more and more evident, but I think more action is needed. And again, one area of research to really look at this type of interactions.
Thank you all. Let's give a big round of applause to our four panelists.